In 2020, Portland, Oregon, became the first U.S. city to decriminalize the possession of hard drugs such as heroin and methamphetamine. The goal was to tackle the city's drug problem with a more progressive approach, shifting the focus from criminalization to public health. However, this well-intentioned policy soon led to devastating consequences. By 2021, the city witnessed a surge in drug-related deaths, rampant crime, and a downtown area transformed into a lawless zone, littered with needles and drug paraphernalia. The death toll skyrocketed, crime rates surged, and businesses closed as residents fled the increasingly dangerous environment. The progressive policy had failed dramatically, and earlier this year, city officials reversed course, acknowledging the disaster decriminalization had created. Across the Atlantic, in Glasgow, Scotland, similar scenes are emerging. The city has the highest rate of drug-related deaths in Scotland, and Scotland itself holds the tragic title of having the highest drug death rate in Europe. In 2023, the country saw a 12% rise in drug deaths, with over 1,100 lives lost. Glasgow's streets, much like Portland's, are filled with addicts slumped in doorways or sprawled unconscious in alleys, their bodies ravaged by heroin, meth, and, increasingly, fentanyl. Scotland, facing what its government has called a public health emergency, is now looking to follow in Portland's footsteps by adopting a public health approach to drug addiction. Scottish Education Secretary Jenny Gilruth recently emphasized that criminalizing drug users had failed and that a new strategy focusing on health rather than punishment was needed. She pointed to places around the world where decriminalization had supposedly been successful, but failed to name any specific examples. Glasgow is set to test this approach by opening the UK's first supervised drug consumption room. Located in the city's East End, the facility will allow addicts to use Class A drugs under the supervision of clinical staff, providing a non-judgmental space for drug use. It has received the blessing of Scotland's Lord Advocate, Dorothy Bain, who said it would not be in the public interest to prosecute those who use drugs in the facility. This shift in policy represents a move toward de facto decriminalization. Police in Scotland have already been given the discretion to issue warnings, rather than arrest, those found in possession of Class A drugs. Drugs are confiscated, but users are not criminally charged. Critics argue this has led to an unofficial decriminalization, much like what happened in Portland, where addicts began to flood into the city, seeing it as a safe haven for drug use. As crime and addiction soared, Portland was overwhelmed, and many fear Glasgow will soon experience the same. Anne-Marie Ward, a former addict and CEO of the charity Faces and Voices of Recovery UK, warns that Scotland is heading down a dangerous path. The harm reduction approach, she argues, does not address the root causes of addiction, such as homelessness, poverty, trauma, and mental health issues. In Portland, the focus on harm reduction, providing more needles, safer supplies, and supervised drug use only made the problem worse by enabling addiction rather than encouraging recovery. Ward believes Scotland is repeating the same mistakes, fostering a system that keeps addicts dependent on drugs instead of offering real solutions. The evidence from Portland is sobering. The city's drug-related death rate increased by 1,500% during decriminalization, and crime rose as addicts turned to theft to fund their habits. Open-air drug markets flourished, and the city's streets became a wasteland, littered with needles and overrun by desperate, zombified addicts. Even liberal-leaning publications like the New York Times, which had once supported relaxed drug laws, were forced to admit that Portland had become a drug user's paradise and a living nightmare for its residents. Despite these warnings, the Scottish government insists decriminalization will save lives. It argues that a public health approach, combined with support services and harm reduction strategies, can reduce the harms associated with drug use. However, critics point out that the government has failed to provide concrete examples of where this approach has been successful. In fact, much of the international evidence suggests the opposite, that decriminalization leads to an increase in drug availability, crime, and death. Dr. Neil McKeganey, co-director of the Centre for Substance Use Research in Glasgow, warns that Scotland risks becoming the go-to place for drug users if it continues down this path. He argues that allowing people to use illegal drugs without fear of prosecution will not reduce harm but will instead entrench the drug trade and exacerbate the problems. McKeganey believes Scotland's proposed consumption room will create a legal grey area, where police will have to turn a blind eye to drug possession and use, effectively creating a tolerance zone around the facility. Ward shares these concerns. She argues that the consumption room sends mixed messages to society, suggesting that drug use can be safe and acceptable, rather than a dangerous path to addiction and death. Without consequences for drug use, she says, there is no incentive for addicts to seek help or change their behavior. The current system, focused on harm reduction, has failed to offer real opportunities for recovery, instead keeping people trapped in addiction for decades. Portland, once seen as a progressive model for drug policy reform, learned the hard way that decriminalization without adequate support systems leads to disaster. Scotland, facing its own drug crisis, appears determined to follow the same path. With the highest drug death rate in Europe and crime closely linked to addiction, the country's move toward decriminalization and the opening of a supervised consumption room may push it further into crisis. While Scottish officials remain confident that their approach will save lives, the experience of Portland serves as a stark warning of what may lie ahead. As Glasgow prepares to open its consumption room, many are left wondering if the city is about to repeat the same tragic mistakes. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for more updates on celebrity deaths and news updates.